Everyone. So today I'm going to analyze and discuss the game between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Duda Jan-Krzysztof. Now this, I hope I'm saying his name right. We have a cat in the background. Her name is Nina, so say hi to Nina. So the game started off with one knight f3, d5, and g3, and this shows that Nepo is actually prepared to meet any sort of systems in the Catalan with maybe knight f6, c6, c5. So I think he was ready for a fight with some sort of theoretical Catalan. Instead, Duda decided to play bishop g4 here, and this looks like a reverse Trompowsky. Now, again, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, if we flip this over to the black side, just quickly flip the board, we could see that after d4 and knight f6, white has this move bishop g5. And this is a Trompowsky variation. And it's almost as if black played here g6, and we get the same position on the board after this, except color is reversed. So the idea here is that black might exchange his bishop off or keep it, and it will come to the king side on g6 usually, and it will influence the queen side. Now, I think the way Nepo played this is really instructive, just showing how badly placed this bishop is from the opening. So bishop g2, e6, and now this move basically cuts off the connection of the bishop from black's queen side. So the bishop can never go back to c8, it can never go back to d7, and that means that at some point white may have this option to play queen b3 and start attacking the b7 pawn. This is actually a pretty common idea, especially in like London systems, when black plays bishop f5 and then e6. So white just castles here. He doesn't commit to the center yet with d4, c4. He doesn't really show what he's trying to do. Knight d7, h3. Now this looks like a very passive move, just kicking the bishop, but it actually has a real purpose. At some point, white is going to have this kingside initiative, and he would like to have this move h3 inserted, because then g4 is a lot easier to play. So this just kicks the bishop away, and if black were to take here, for example, then we would get a position like this, and white is absolutely fine here. Black really doesn't want to give up his light-squared bishop for no reason, because then this bishop has no opponent, and white can start playing c4 and start harassing black's center. So that's not ideal, so bishop h5 was played. Now d4. White commits in the center with d4, and basically controls the e5 square for the moment. Knight f6, and now c4. And here Duda played c6 here. Now, it is interesting to note that this could be taken, and then it leads to pretty interesting but kind of complex positions that sort of look like Slavs, where black plays c6, b5, and tries to keep this pawn, while white plays e4. And for example, like knight bd2, b5, a4, c6, takes, knight e5, knight d5, and the game goes on. Like for example, knight e4, and then a5, and it's really not clear how white is going to play on. I mean, black has already started his queenside initiative. So yeah, this pawn could have been taken. Would have led to an interesting game, but I think he didn't do it because it does lead to very sharp positions where if black messes up, then he's dead. So I think understandably he played here c6, just holding everything together. And this sort of looks like one of those mainline Catalans, but instead of the bishop being on c8, it's on h5, and white threw in the move h3. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, for example, if we go all the way back here to g3, bishop g4, if instead, just going to show a very standard mainline Catalan here. So in this case, it's a similar position, but the bishop is still on c8, and it will come to b7 or a6. And the game gets very complicated from there. White tries to basically use his center and cramp black, while black tries to break out on the queen side. So instead, we get this position, where the pawn structure is similar to a Catalan, but the bishop is on h5. Now, this is actually a very big difference, because the bishop on h5, white can argue that it's actually misplaced. So he took here, and this was to prevent anything with, so for example, if white were to play just a simple move like knight c3, then black could take this pawn, and it's actually pretty serious. Sure, white gets an e4, but white is a pawn down. So bishop e4. Now e4 is threatened. Queen e2, castles. And now you could take this, but then you drop e4, so that's not ideal. And in the meantime, black could try to play b5. He could try to play a6 to hold that, maybe a5, maybe queen a5. Maybe he can just take the knight. It's really not a simple position to play, especially with this bishop pinning this knight. In this case, this bishop is actually placed in a decent way because the center is a little bit looser. When other positions like this arise, usually the bishop is still on the queen side. So that is why Nepo took here to prevent that from happening. E takes. C takes is also possible, although very infrequently played, because it does open up the C file for white to use. So, and then here he played this move knight e5. Truthfully, I think Nepo, I don't know if he prepared this, but he definitely had the right ideas in mind. Knight e5 is a pretty interesting move. It looks really simple to play, but after Duda took, I think this was actually the first mistake, taking this knight. In hindsight, he should have probably played maybe knight e4. And the point is this, is that after, let's say, white takes and plays knight c3 to try to pick up this pawn, black can just continue with, like, not f5. f5 is a poor move because of queen b3. And this diagonal is weak. This file is also weak. The b7 pawn is weak. Not f5. That was one of my notes. Bishop e7 instead, just a very calm move. And if this is taken, then you can just exchange everything and you win back e2. And this is actually a very fine endgame for black. Black has the bishop pair. And this even if white advances with f4, it's really not that scary. And if knight d6 is played, I think black can just move or take and maybe just pile up on the pawn and eventually win it back. So that's maybe what he should have done. There's other variations here. For example, there was a game between Giri and Grandelius, which instead of any of this, he actually black here played bishop g6. But bishop g6 was not a logical choice. So instead of taking this knight, black played bishop g6, or Giri played bishop g6. And this is just way too slow. After this, white gained control. And eventually he got this very strong position. The point of a5 is because, of course, if this is taken, then b7 becomes weaker. He can't play b5 easily because c6 is going to fall. Very complex. But f4, and white gains a lot of control on the king side. This knight, now if you take it, well, you're going to just give white an amazing center. And eventually Grandelius actually won this game, played e4, and just crushed Giri after 77 moves. So that's why this move is really tricky. It's hard to actually see what to do. I mean, you could leave this knight here, but then you have to deal with the consequences of just keeping the knight in the center. I mean, white can still try to play f4 at some point, and it's really not easy for black to deal with this. So I think that's why Duda took this. But I think he then underestimated just how strong this pawn is. So knight bd2. Now, if you just basically feed this into a computer, it's going to say that it's around equal. But actually, I would prefer white here. Of course, you don't want to take this knight, and the other variation, basically taking the knight was fine because you had knight c3, and there was no real queen exchange. In this case, there is, so it's not logical to take the knight. But anyways, yeah, this is not really looking great. So he took this knight and then played bishop c5. And I think this was, again, not a great idea. Because after rook c1, this bishop is actually loose. And if you put it back on b6, well, then white can just continue with g4 and then maybe f4 at some point. He could play king h2 very slowly, and then white has this interesting like attack on the king side. And it's really not easy to see what is black really doing here. What has black achieved here? So queen e7 was played. And I think this was just to hold the bishop for the moment, maybe eye up the e-pawn, and maybe castle queenside, but we'll see in a second why that's impossible. So king h2, basically this just steps out of this pin, prepares to play f4 or g4 followed by f4. And now black castles. Now, you cannot castle queenside because there is this move, queen c2. And that just wins on the spot because queen f5 is threatened. You can see how this bishop is very poorly placed. And the bishop on c5 is loose. So this is not working for black. So you had to castle this way. I mean, really, what else are you going to do? There's very few moves here. Again, if you try something very calm and slow like this, then white's just going to play f4 and then follow up with g4, f5. And the attack is just very natural, very simple for white. So king h2, castles, and now g4 anyways. Bishop g6, and now f4. h6. Now, in another game between, I'm actually looking at it right now, in another game between Svidler and Karyarkin here played f5, and he managed to actually hold that game after queen b3, rook a d8, and then g takes f5 occurred, bishop takes f5, and actually black managed to keep this together. Instead of that, I think Duda was understandably pretty frightened of this kingside advance. And he played the move h6 just to preserve the bishop. But we'll see in a second that this move is actually... it gives white a hook, in a way, to play for. f5, the way Karyarkin did it, at least tried to stop this advance immediately. And if this happened, then the bishop would go back. So queen e1, this is a great move. And actually very common in like Sicilian positions where you play queen e1 to go queen g3. This is the whole idea. Now, I do want to show what would happen if white, for example, instead of queen e1, went f5 instead. Well, the bishop goes back. And now there's a problem with this pawn. This pawn is actually not supported well because this pawn is moved. And black can actually use the weakness of this e-pawn as a way to defend himself. So let's say bishop f4 just to hold the pawn for the moment. Now bishop b6, this is a great move. Just stepping out of this rook's way and planning to play bishop c7. And white is going to have a hard time actually defending this pawn. So for example, if queen e1 and then bishop c7, let's say queen g3. This is obviously not the best way for white to play. And now this great tactic here, g5, basically forcing the bishop away from this pawn. And we could see how the lineup with the queen and the king and the bishop force white to take this pawn, but now the rook joins the game, and rook takes f4 is threatened. So this is really like the kind of thing that could happen if you play too quickly as white, if you don't actually think out a plan. So that's just an example. I mean, there are other defenses here, like the computer suggests playing instead of queen g3 like e4, and then doing this, and this is really not ideal for Nepo because you're going to end up in an endgame and the rook is pinned, and like this is actually a great move, queen d6, and it's really not obvious how white's going to go from here. I mean, sure, he still has a kingside swarm going, but it's a lot slower now, and because of this annoying pin and possibly the rook joining the game, it's not so clear how white is going to break through. So instead of f5, because that's not a great move, he played queen e1, just holding everything together. He doesn't really have to rush this at all. And rook fe8. I honestly don't know the difference between bringing this rook in or this rook in. Maybe this rook was supposed to stay on f8 in hindsight, but who knows. So rook fe8, queen g3, makes very logical sense. Now the e-pawn is supported. But again, I don't think he actually rushes f5. I think he's ready to just play maybe bishop c3. Maybe he's going to play e3. Maybe he's just going to push h4. White has so many ways to play this. He doesn't actually have to rush anything. So bishop h7, just preempting f5. If, for example, a move like bishop b6 was played, because this bishop does end up a problem. Like, for example, if the move f5 is played, that's fine, because in a way, black cannot really take this because the bishop is loose. So let's say a move like bishop b6 was played. And white just continues, h4. And if you try bishop c7, no problem, g5, h5, and queen f3, and the bishop has to hold this pawn, and, white can slowly build up with bishop c3, e3, and just, try to get some sort of play going. f5 can come soon enough, bishop h3 at some point. There's so many ways to play here. But yeah, so this didn't happen. Instead, queen g3, bishop h7, which preempts f5, but it also looks a bit passive here. And h4 was played. This is just a very straightforward attack. Rook a d8. And now g5. And here we come to a crossroad. Like, what does black really do? Does he take? Does he move the king? Does he do something else? It's actually really hard for black to find a good decision here. For example, if king h8 were played, which looks really scary because you allow this, this is not so clear because rook g8 might come. And not only that, you actually opened up files for this king. And in a way, this bishop is actually covering some vital squares. So it's not so clear. And now, f5 is not so clear either because at some point maybe e5 will be too weak. And this king is actually, looks sort of secure. White doesn't really have a clear way to attack him, and rook g8 is coming. So let's say so the computer suggests this incredible line with rook takes c5. Point being, if you play, for example, f5 immediately, obviously this can't be taken because after takes, you win the bishop. But black has this great move, bishop d4, just destroying this pawn here, and white can't really defend it. So that's why the computer suggests taking this bishop and then playing f5, and this is a way to generate play for white. But again, it's not clear because there's still rook g8 threats. There might even still be f6 ideas where you lock down the entire structure. The rook is holding this pawn so if the rook moves, the pawn might fall. And this king could actually be under some serious threats. So that's why this wasn't played. So for example, like this. And now this move d4. And black just holds this because if anything, like if you try e6, for example, just to break things open, it doesn't do anything. I mean, it looks really scary, but actually now lines are open against the white king. The rook is on this file. The queen is actually very active. It might come to one of these squares. So it's not really clear what's going on. And you can even push this pawn and try to break things open with this rook. So, and white doesn't have any clear way of breaking into this king position. So that's why I think king h8 looks really scary, and that's why I think Duda didn't play it. Although it probably was a defense based on the computer's recommendations, but it's not easy to play, especially in a tournament like this. So that's why I think he went for h takes g5. Now I do want to briefly mention what would happen if h5, just closing things down. Well, now white can play f5, and again, this can't be taken because c5 is hanging. So, and the problem for black here is that he can't really stop e6. So the point of e6 is that if this is taken, then g6 just wins the bishop. So let's say if black tries to this is black's best defense here. It's bishop d4, and then after e6, g6, and letting white take on f7 and then closing things down. And in a way, this is completely entombed. So I think that's why the h5 wasn't played, because white would just press forward anyways. e6 would come, and there would be no way to actually save this bishop. One way or another, this bishop is going to be locked out of the game. The computer at this point suggests something like king h8 just to play bishop g8, but that's a ridiculous way to play for anyone. So that's why this wasn't played. And I think when Duda looked at his options here, I'm not sure how much time he spent. He just took this pawn. But now this creates a bigger problem because now the h-file is open. So for example, after something like bishop f5, let's say, trying to just hold it, play g6, king g7, rook h8. Maybe that's a plan. It looked logical to me. Now queen h4. And this is not simple, because if you try something like this, then suddenly the rook is coming to the game. King g3 is a real threat. And it's not so simple to actually get the king out. So if you were to, of course, go with g6, white could actually just play here queen h6, and I think this is completely losing for black because rook h1 is coming, king g3, and there's no way to stop this. I mean, black would just have to give up material. And this queen is completely immobilized because c5 might hang. So really not clear what's supposed to happen here. So that's why Duda here played bishop b4. To try to exchange pieces off, because in a way, like, this bishop was a problem piece, and he has to find a way to get rid of it. This was taken, and the queen was put away, and now f5, and now we can see how queen takes e5 is not a thing. And this comes with a very serious threat of just playing e6, and after takes g6, and this bishop is gone. So Duda, I think, probably realized this and thought, okay, I have no way of avoiding that. If you play something like g6, you're just going to get locked up with f6. And again, this bishop is dead, and white has full control over the h-file. This plan is very, very, very menacing. Well, maybe not immediately, because obviously the queen is here. Maybe something like queen h3, rook h1, duck the king back, and then I don't see a way that black really escapes this. He would have to give up material here. So that's not good. So queen takes b2. I think Duda realized he couldn't do anything about that threat, and he just decided to take the pawns. Now, of course, if this is taken g6, I mean, this was allowed. The other point of it is that he's just going to take and then play g6 anyways, so you really have no way of stopping this. So f takes happened, and Duda simply gave up the bishop. Now, if we look at the material count, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 3 white pawns. And there are some threats here. This is actually not that simple. So that's why rook b1 was played, just to distract the queen a bit. And queen f6. Now, if queen takes e2, well, that doesn't really work because of rook b7. And there are threats on the g7 square, and white is just a bit quicker. For example, if rook e7, then takes, and then rook f5, and actually it's not really easy for black to play. Black has to somehow move these pawns, but this bishop is well placed, this queen is well placed, this rook is well placed, so it's not simple. So for example, if something like a5, bishop h3, the bishop is actually going to come to f5 to hold this pawn. Let's say queen e2. These checks really don't do anything. And now bishop f5. If this is taken, then you're just basically opening yourself up for attack. Maybe the rook can move back, bishop f5. Maybe this check is even good. It's just completely unclear. I mean, I can't play this. I would still mess this up as white, but I think for someone like Nepo, he would have no problem converting this. So that is why after rook b1, instead of taking this pawn, which would lead to disaster, he played queen f6. And now rook takes b7. And there's always this annoying threat on g7. Like, that always exists. If this is taken, I mean, something even like rook f4 or rook h4 might come. The pawn is actually a decent cover for the king. So rook takes e2. And now rook takes f5. Very simple tactic. If this is taken, of course, queen g7 is made. So queen h6. King g1. No point in pinning yourself with, like, you know, queen h3. There's no reason to do that. It's just not necessary. So king g1, and he's actually really safe here. This king might get checked around a little bit, but white is actually completely safe. And rook f7, a very strong move. This is a real threat, and this is still a problem. This queen can't really move from its post. So rook check. The bishop jump back. The same thing would happen if something like queen c1. Because this threat is just too much. Black can't just leave that square alone. And now this interesting move d4. Now I really want to show what happens after something like rook g5 and queen d6. Oh, do want to show you something, guys. If, for example, here queen takes h7, in this position, I went back a little bit before white played rook takes a2. Sorry, black played rook takes a2. Rook h5 wins, because after takes, you just mate. So that's just a really cute little tactic there. Rook takes a2, rook bf7, rook a1, bishop f1, and now let's move d4. Rook g5, again, just hitting this pawn. And now let's move queen d6, and queen f2. Now, what happens if white were to rush this? This is very interesting. This holds for black. This is a really nice trick. I mean, even while losing Duda could still find tricks like this. I mean, you do really have to admire like the way like these players calculate and the little tricks they find to actually grip to any chance. D3 just holds because there's no way to actually break through to this king without losing this pawn and keeping this rook. this rook is just rock solid here, and this pawn might push through, and these pawns might run. So it's actually holding for black amazingly. So that's why queen f2 was played, just avoiding all of that. And these are real threats. Not right now because the queen is there, but this is still a threat, and still a lot of problems here. Queen a3 and rook g3. Not taking, because after queen e3, this is annoying again, because this is pinned. And if you take, you're ending up in the same position where you cannot, this pawn is actually like a bother to white, because he can't break through. Like, this rook is sitting here and is defending the back rank, and these pawns are rolling. This rook is pinning the bishop, so it's really not that clear. Black can still hold on for a bit, but just a very simple move, rook g3, and that ends the game. Black just has no good moves here. This queen e3 resource is gone. So something like this, now you can take. Because now queen e3 is not a thing, and this is completely different. These rooks with coordination with this queen are just too much for black to handle. Maybe even this might be a real idea. It's just really difficult to defend for black, and logically he resigned here. Now, I do want to go back for a little bit and just basically just understand where Duda went wrong. So I think bishop g4, I mean, I'm not a 2700, but I think this is actually a pretty bad idea, because Nepo was prepared for it, and I don't think Duda was. I think after something like e6, he took away a lot of his options. But I guess this is how you should play it. And after h3, I think Duda simply... This bishop was just misplaced all game, and at the end it was taken. I wish there was a lead chess option to like clear all the coloring at once. So c6, I mean... But again, this bishop is just completely... In a way, it's out of the game. It has to sort of exchange itself here. And I think maybe Duda should have done that earlier. Just to exchange some pieces and just hold off white for the moment. Because f4 came, and then g4, and this bishop actually turned out to be a problem piece. And after this, taking here was probably not a logical decision. Not a good decision, because it just led to like a very poor position for black to play. Just not ideal. And I mean, doing this, like taking this, and then playing this move bishop c5, I mean, I don't really know what else to suggest, to be honest. I mean, bishop c5 looks natural. It has been played before. But if you already have to play this to stop f4 and g4 from coming, and you're gonna castle this way anyways, you've already messed up in the opening, because you're basically accepting the fact that white's going to attack me and I can't do anything about it. Like, all white has to do is play king h2, and then f4, and then g4, and black is in serious trouble. This bishop is going to get pushed around. It's just not ideal to play. This is not a great opening choice. Rook c1 was a great move. Not even bothering with king h2, just like saying like this bishop is going to be a problem for you. And if you waste your time, I'm just going to gain the initiative. And I mean, here, like, again, like, there was this pawn storm was a very serious problem for black, and this all came from the opening. We're on move 16. On move 16, white already has a very strong attack, and it's just difficult for black to untangle here. H6, also probably not a great decision. I mean, maybe f5 should have been tried, like in that game with Svidler and Karyarkin. But again, it's really hard to say. I mean, you really have to have nerves of steel to play like this as black and hold it. And again, I just think that there was no way for black to actually untangle this whole game. And I think the last mistake here was taking this. He should have went for maybe some complexity with king h8. Like, yes, he's worse, but at least he would have some sort of counterplay. At least he would have some sort of resources with bishop d4. Maybe the queen would come into the game. It wouldn't be so clear. But here, this just gave white everything he needed. Gave him the h-file, took away this pawn that was defending the king, and now this resource with f5, e6, and g6 exists, and it's just a very annoying position for black to defend, and I think it all went downhill from there. I don't think there's even saving this. I mean, like, once f5 is played, e6 is coming, and you're going to lose the bishop. But yeah, a great game by Nepo. He really is playing like some outstanding chess. I don't know if I would be interested in seeing another Nepo-Carlsen rematch, considering how it went last time. But I have to give him credit where it's due. I mean, he's playing amazing attacking chess. He did the same thing to Ding Liren in round one, and then he did something similar to Firouzja. So let's look at the standings for now. Nepo is in the lead with 4.5 out of 6. Caruana and Nakamura with 4 out of 6 and 3 out of 6 respectively. Rapport is on 3 out of 6. Ding is on 2.5 out of 6 with Rajabov, Duda, and Firouzja. Well, Firouzja is last place with 2 out of 6. He lost a game against Caruana today. Really not having a good tournament, but I think a lot of people really like to crap on Firouzja. But I think he's very young, and he's never been in a tournament like this, and he has a lot of pressure on him, especially at this world stage. So I think this is going to be a great experience for him, just so he gets to figure out, how he needs to play, what he needs to prep with, and what he needs to change in his strategy for next time. He's going to be back, and this tournament's not over at all. I think there's still 8 rounds to go. So we'll see how everything goes. All right, thank you so much. I'll be covering the Caruana Firouzja game next. All right, take it easy.